With the latest agriculture news from across the state and nation, it's time for the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. Here's your host, Sabrina Halvorson.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us this morning on the AgNet News Hour. I am Sabrina Halvorson here with Lorrie Boyer. Morning, Lorrie.
A very good morning to you and everyone.
So we're going to talk this morning about the Antiquities Act. All right, I'm already not pronouncing it well. But so it's an interesting topic. And the reason it's coming up is because President Biden just announced two more sites in California that he's, making into national monuments. And so these are in one's in Southern California, one's in Northern California. Southern California one is near the Joshua Tree National Park, and in Northern California near the Oregon border. And so basically by making these into national monuments, he's using it goes back to the Antiquities Act. And there are some ag groups that have issues with that. And so, it's an interesting topic. And I think it's one that deserves a lot of conversation.
And we are referring today, or going to be referring mainly to the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, who is very vocal about this. They've been vocal about this in the past. I will have to, while we're talking here today, I'll look at exactly what the Antiquities Act is, but just kind of a overview of what I know about it in reporting all these years on it, is that it is a way for the federal government to designate something or acreage or whatever they deem as a national monument that will be protected from further development. And sometimes they're developed into a national park where visitors can come, and sometimes they're not. But
Right.
it's a conservation practice, I guess, if you will.
Right. So it was originally created by President Theodore Roosevelt, and his thought, and and he was also the one that made national parks so important around the nation. But it was originally to protect Native American ruins, like prehistoric Native American ruins and artifacts, like cliff dwellings and the pueblos and things like that. To protect them from things like looting and destruction from the general public. And it allows the federal government to, they call it safeguarding these historic landmarks and prehistoric structures. But what it also does is it makes that land unavailable for certain types of public use. And that is where the NCBA comes in and strongly, in fact, in one of their press releases that you found earlier from 2023, they used the word slammed. They slammed the president's designation. That time it was in Arizona. And again, NCBA this week sending out a press release about this week's designations in California, again, criticizing the use of the Antiquities Act to protect this land.
Some of their beef, play on words, some of their beef is the fact that it does oftentimes take land out of production or land out of being able to be grazed, and also sometimes has messes with the permits, the federal grazing permits that ranchers and farmers use to graze their cattle out, which is close and near to some of these monument designations that we're talking about. Also, sometimes when we're talking about taking something and putting it into the Antiquities Act, although we think about monuments and structures and formations and things like that, sometimes it really is about the land itself. And that includes, of course, minerals. It includes perhaps production ag or grazing land or grazing grasses, and also water aspects. So it takes some of that from private property owners in some cases, or at least restricts that in some cases on what ranchers and farmers can do on our land as a result of the designation.
Right. And so that brings into an interesting, consideration because, some of this land, yes, this land does need to be protected. And that is the federal government's job. One of their key jobs really is to protect our land and our resources. And this is one of the ways in which that they do that. However, if you are a cattle rancher, let's say, and you use some of that land, you're used to having that public land. available for your use, and now all of a sudden you're being told, oh, you can't use that anymore. I can see how that would be upsetting.
In addition to that, the government doesn't exactly have a great history on how they manage land. I mean, we're seeing a lot of fires as a result. Some will say even these big fires in Southern California can be attributed to how they are not managing land. That's another concern for NCBA and for other groups, is that the government doesn't do a great job in managing land. So the more that they put into the Antiquity Act, that is the more land that may not be managed properly, which means wildfires, which means pest infestations and things like that.
Right. So, looking a little bit more at the actual land here in California that was designated this week, the one in Southern California, it's about 644,000 acres on Joshua Tree's southern border, heading, stretching over to the Colorado River in Southern California. And by creating that, this is according to CNN here now, uh, by creating that new monument, Biden has created the largest corridor of protected land in the continental U.S., spanning approximately 600 miles. So, and that is from southeast Utah to Southern California. That's a broad swath of land.
That is a lot of land. I guess I didn't reckon or didn't realize the amount of acres that is involved in this, which is again part of probably why NCBA is really pushing back on this.
Right, because it is so much land. Um, Honestly, I've been to Joshua Tree many, many years ago, and I can't remember a thing about it. And I should maybe not say that. But I'm trying desperately to remember, what is the land like out there, and what is this actually used for? And what I'm curious is if this is another knee-jerk reaction to a, presidential action, or is this an actual concern that is going to actually have an effect on people? And I really see this going either way. And while we ponder that, unfortunately, we do need to take a quick break, but we'll continue talking about it when we get back. This is the AgNet News Hour. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. She's Lorrie Boyard. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. Here's Sabrina Halvorson.
Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. We are talking about the Antiquities Act and the presidential designation of national monuments. And so just before we went to the break, I was questioning the land that NCBA is upset over. Is this their reaction just again to the government doing something, the government, using its authority? Or is this actual working land that will have an effect on people? And honestly, I don't know the answer to that one for this specifically, this area.
I don't know that I know the answer to the second part of that question real well, but the first part, when you talked about, is this just another government overreach type thing that they're reacting to and saying, I believe that to be true, that they are pushing back again on the government. And I don't know all the background on how these Antiquities Act designations occur, what kind of feasibility studies or what kind of feedback and comment process they have. I'll be honest, I don't know that. I would assume there's some of that process in there. But this was done literally here in the last hour of the Biden administration. It is a substantial amount of acreage. It does cut into rural communities. So I'm going to guess there are ranches and farms that are affected by putting this land into antiquities. And I think that's part of the issue there, is this last hour and not having a lot of notice and not having a lot of input into it. But also this has happened in the past. So I think it was kind of another trigger as well for NCBA to be like, wait, what are we doing? We're doing this again. Here we are. And, there's a lot of, as I mentioned, all the resources that we talked about before the break, there's a lot of planning that goes into that. So I think they're questioning, did the government, in fact, do that planning? Did they consult with people that are affected? Did they go through everything they need to go through? I think there's questions on their behalf to the government before they actually did this designation. And here they come out with it and boom, it's in place.
Right. Interestingly, the last time that President Trump was in office, he actually shrunk the size of two national monuments. They were both in Utah, I believe. And he and I'm curious if he will do that again in his next administration, if he will use some of his, you know, presidential power to again decrease the areas of some of these national monuments. And um, I think that is also very interesting. Okay, so now this land is protected under the Biden administration. Well, in 2 weeks, when that administration changes, is it no longer
Yeah.
protected? And can the new president go in and say, no, this is too much? You know, let's not, or let's go back and change that again. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a good question. And it always bothers me when we talk about things like this in general, because our taxpayer dollars are working for the Biden administration to make this decision. And then if Trump does come in and rescind some of that, which he has every right to do, don't get me wrong. I mean, that's the political democracy we live in. But then our taxpayers are at work again, undoing what was done. And that always bothers me.
Yes, because it's just such a waste.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Exactly.
And, you know, and we can argue the point, was it a waste the first time or a waste the second time?
Right.
Either way, it's a waste.
Exactly. Yeah, that's my point. That's my point. And whether or not anybody agrees with NCBA and their pushback and what they're saying, I have to just say that I am glad that we do have organizations out there, particularly in the ag space, that are monitoring things like this and then are being vocal and doing what they believe, again, whether or not everyone agrees with them, doing what they believe is right for their constituents. It's so important to have our ag organizations lobbying for these farmers and ranchers who are busy putting food on our table every day.
Yeah, I agree. But I also have to say that I really like our national monuments and our national parks. And I'm a big fan of protecting some of these areas that that should be protected. So I think that it's great that we have a system in place that can do that, that can protect these areas and these lands despite the interests from other organizations that want to use the land differently, that could lead to, possibly to the destruction of some of these things. So I think that having these protections in place is important too. However, anytime the government's in charge of something, you have to really keep a close eye on it.
And then I always question too other things that go back into prior laws that we have. In this case, I would cite the Taylor Grazing Act in 1934, which protects grazing rights and private property rights. Does things like this infringe on this? Does
Right.
these decisions infringe on those laws? And if so, which law do you uphold and how do you mitigate that?
Right. And, is that something that NCBA could use to possibly, take this into the litigation kind of phase, you know, to perhaps bring about some changes? I don't know. If we knew the answers to those, we'd both be making a lot more money.
Exactly. Exactly. We should now.
All
We're
right.
solving all the problems of the world right now, Sabrina. So
That's right. We're just lucky they let us on the air. All right, with that, we do need to take another quick break. This is the AgNet News Hour. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. She's Lorrie Boyer. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. Here's Lorrie Boyer.
joining me on the show here today is Aaron Hager. He is a weed science extension specialist with the University of Illinois, and he has been working on and conversing about the latest strategy that the Environmental Protection Agency has released. This one is the herbicide strategy, so we focus on that today. Tell me more about this strategy, Aaron.
The changes that are going to be forthcoming on virtually every pesticide label due to the U.S. EPA's actions to bring the agency into compliance with the Endangered Species Act. And over time, this will be something that will impact virtually every pesticide that we use here in the country, in our agricultural systems. We, I guess, in the weed science arena, are, I guess, the first discipline to try to understand this, since the first group of pesticides the agency selected were herbicides. And the agency has developed what they call the herbicide strategy. And that would be the approach that the agency is going to take to introduce what they refer to as mitigation practices. And by mitigation practices, those types of practices that would further reduce the likelihood of a pesticide or a pesticide application causing any damage to an endangered species itself or the critical habitat that endangered species relies upon. And we we had a draft of the strategy. Oh golly, I can't even remember when it came out. I think early in 2023, and it was going to be very, very difficult. Our assessment, it was going to be very difficult for users to be in compliance with that strategy as was initially proposed by the agency. But of course, there was a comment period that the agency had, and a lot of agricultural organizations got together and made some very good and thoughtful comments to the agency. Why certain practices may not be feasible. Hey, US EPA, have you thought about perhaps allowing this as a strategy? And when the final strategy came out, it was very different from what the original strategy was. And I was very pessimistic after the draft strategy was released. But, to the agency's credit, I think they did listen to a lot of the comments. They made a lot of significant changes between the draft strategy and the final strategy. And now I'm much more optimistic that we're going to be able to be in compliance with many of these provisions now that are within this herbicide strategy.
How are extension agents such as yourself working with growers on this?
Well, we actually started these conversations about 2 years ago when the agency really started to ramp up their efforts with what they were planning to do, again, to bring the agency into compliance. So it's something that we've tried to make, farmers and custom applicators and, seed company folks, across pretty much the wide spectrum of agriculture, bring them some awareness that this is happening now, and it's going to continue to happen. And when we first started having these conversations a couple of years ago, it was like you were talking with a room full of ghosts. Nobody knew anything about this. Nobody had really heard about it or thought about it or gave much consideration to it. So nowadays, when we have these presentations and these conversations, I think the awareness level is much greater than what it was. But there's still a lot of questions that remain unanswered. And so one of the things that our professional society, the Weed Science Society of America, has done is formed an ESA committee to, again, try to understand the strategies, how they may impact herbicide users, offer suggestions maybe for other types of mitigations that could be possible. Dr. Stanley Culpepper at the University of Georgia has done a tremendous amount of work in this area. Dr. Bill Chisholm, who used to work at EPA, he chairs that committee and has done just a yeoman's amount of work really in trying to prepare resources and materials that are readily available for anybody who wants to understand this process and how this is going to impact pesticide users as we move forward.
Who does the strategy actually apply to, Aaron?
The herbicide strategy right now applies primarily to agricultural uses. There actually are some areas that are not covered by this, at least not right now for the herbicide strategy. For example, pastures and rangelands are not included in this. But for most of our major and even minor agricultural crops across the country, they will be impacted by this strategy for herbicides, and then in the future, the insecticide strategy, and ultimately then also the fungicide strategy.
Aaron, can you recap with me just to clarify where we are at with these strategies being released by EPA?
I believe the insecticide strategy, the draft insecticide strategy was released, I believe sometime late last summer or early fall. I think the finalization of that will be sometime here in 2025. And then the fungicide strategy will be the third one. And there's a rodenticide strategy that's in the works also. But for, I think, most of the folks that you and I visit with, probably the herbicide, insecticide, and fungicide strategies would be the ones that they would be most impacted by. Now, the other piece of good news is that it does appear that a lot of the mitigations are going to be fairly similar among the strategies. And so it won't necessarily be something where you have to have a unique mitigation option just for one group of pesticides. I think a lot of these mitigations that were released with the final herbicide strategy are going to be applicable in many instances to insecticides and fungicides. Don't get me wrong, there will be some differences, of course. But by and large, I think, some of the practices that reduce the likelihood of off-target movement are going to be pretty similar.
Now, I realize anytime we're talking about agency reports or government reports that are involved, these are complicated and aren't real easy. But if I asked you, Aaron, to share maybe 1, 2, or even 3 highlights from this, what would be the biggest things in it that we need to be aware of?
Well, you hit the nail on the head there, Lorrie. I can't tell you the thousands of pages that have gone, of documents that have gone into these, developing these strategies, and what the agency, how they came up with these ideas and these strategies. But it's something that the easiest thing to suggest to people, it's going to be spelled out on every pesticide label eventually. When a new active ingredient comes to the marketplace, it will have now ESA mitigations on that label. For existing pesticides, once they go through the re-registration process, and that occurs, every 15 years, they have to be reevaluated. That's when those provisions will appear on those labels. And so we have one product, I believe it was Liberty Ultra, that BASF received a label for, I think it was in October or November, actually has some ESA mitigations on it. So the first place, obviously, to look is at the herbicide label. It will tell you what types of runoff mitigation practices are needed. It will tell you the number of points that you need to acquire when you make that application. It'll also have a possibility of a downwind buffer and the distance that you may need to set aside on that downwind side of the field when you make that application. And the third part would be, it could also direct the users to consult Bulletins Live 2 to see if there are additional mitigations that need to be in place in specific geographic areas. So things like the runoff mitigations, things like the buffer distances, those will be pretty universal on the product label. But if there's an instance where a pesticide may pose an even greater risk to a particular endangered species, that information would be spelled out in Bulletins Live 2. And there could be some additional precautions or setbacks or restrictions that the user would have to implement if that does actually appear on the Bulletins Live 2 page.
Aaron Hager, Weed Science Extension Specialist with the University of Illinois. We will continue talking about the EPA herbicide strategy right after this. Back we come here today. I'm Lorrie Boyer for AgNet West, and my guest here today is Aaron Hager. He is a weed science extension specialist with the University of Illinois, and we will continue our discussion on the EPA herbicide strategy that has been released. Aaron, does this strategy then pertain to all states?
Well, the strategies themselves will apply to the lower 48 states. So Alaska and Hawaii are not covered on these strategies. It's still a little bit early to understand how this will mesh in, so to speak, with individual state laws. There could be state laws perhaps that are more restrictive than what the strategies are. So it'll be up to each individual state lead agency to, determine what aspects of the strategies, how they will enforce these, who will be responsible for, accumulating these runoff mitigation points. That's still an area that I don't really have good clarification for. The only thing that is somewhat clear is that if I own a farm, if I'm the person who's making that application, then all these mitigations are 100% my responsibility. When you get into different permutations of that, then it becomes a lot less clear. If I cash rent this ground, does that mean that I'm responsible now if I have the application made by a custom applicator? Is the landowner responsible? We really don't have a lot of clarification, and that's where I think a lot of this is going to come down to the state lead agencies and how they're going to interpret this and how they're going to try to enforce this.
That is interesting that you have kind of a blanket approach from the government, then the states fall in under. With something like this, it would seem that there would be more uniformity from state to state to state. That doesn't sound like the case.
It's going to be a little bit challenging, I think, because most of the states here in the Midwest that I have some familiarity with, most of their state lead agencies are just, they're not overrun with employees. Everybody seems to be fairly short-staffed. To date, there's been no resource allocation in terms of finances from the EPA to the states to try to enforce these provisions of this. So, obviously a lot of state lead agencies, since the dicamba soybean first was commercialized in 2017, have run a lot of complaints through there. And a lot of people, a lot of the state lead agencies are very concerned about, okay, what will be US EPA's expectations for the SLAs in terms of the enforcement of this? And will we have the resources that we're going to need? If the EPA is going to say, well, if you have a drift complaint, for example, then when your investigators go out, they may or may not need to check all the other provisions of all pesticides that have been applied there for the ESA compliance.
As of right now, Aaron, if we have somebody listening and they want to ask questions or kind of get a start on what to do, who should they be contacting then?
You can contact your extension weed scientist in your respective states if that's a place to start. As I mentioned earlier, Dr. Bill Chisholm has done a great job in terms of putting together some very basic detailed, spreadsheets, slide presentations, fact sheets, if you would. And those are all available on the Weed Science Society of America webpage. There are several links on there that would take you directly to the EPA documents if you'd like to see these things directly. And again, to the EPA's credit, they also have developed what they call a runoff mitigation calculator. And so if you have to accumulate, let's say, 6 points for a particular product, you can actually use this calculator, and it will take you through each of the steps, each of the possible mitigations that you may or may not be able to use on that particular field. And it will tell you how many points that you have. And if you've satisfied the total number of points, you're good to go. One big advantage, I think, of having that calculator available is that, any individual farmer right now or pesticide applicator, they could start this process right now. They could look at every one of their fields and run this calculator through there to see, okay, how many points do I inherently have on that field? Or if I might be short a point or two, I still have time to implement maybe some off-field practices, maybe a grass waterway, maybe a grass border area. I still have time to get those changes or physical changes to the landscape made before these mitigations become fairly common on pesticide labels.
We are almost out of time here, Aaron. Anything else to mention? Anything else you'd like to add today, Aaron?
We don't have all the answers by any stretch of the imagination, but there will be some areas where you really don't have to worry about the runoff mitigation. So it's a process that will continue to evolve. I give the agency a lot of credit. They're very willing to make some of these mitigations somewhat flexible in terms of adding new ones as technology develops. I don't think anybody would say that we have a complete list of all possible mitigations for the next 10 or 15 years, because obviously, technology is going to change, and there could be some addition and changes made to this list in the future.
Thank you to my guest here today, Aaron Hager, Weed Science Extension Specialist with the University of Illinois. For AgNet West, I'm Lorrie Boyer. Stay tuned as Sabrina Halvorson joins us next.
Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. Here's Sabrina Halvorson.
It's time for this week's Almond Update, brought to you by the Almond Board of California. You can find them online at almonds.com. This week I'm talking with Rebecca Bailey, Senior Specialist in Industry Relations, and we're chatting about the Almond Conference. So Rebecca, to start us off with, how was the 2024 Almond Conference?
Yeah, it's crazy to believe it's been over a month since we had the Almond Conference in December, but it was a fantastic show. As always, it was 3 days in downtown Sacramento at the Convention Center. We ended up having just over 3,600 total attendees that came over the 3 days. And then of that, of course, we always want to know of those who were growers and or handlers, as that's our target primary audience that we serve. And we had just about 900 growers and handlers represented, which was amazing. Of course, we had a number of sessions. We had more than 20 sessions over the days, from breakout sessions to general sessions with content of all sorts related to almonds. And then we had just over 230 exhibitors. So we had a pretty packed trade show floor as well. So lots of networking opportunities and just a good time for everyone to come together and get those really important updates of what's going on within the industry.
Yeah, I was excited for many of the presentations that I went to. There was so much good information that was given. And I know that you guys were able to get the presentation PDFs up online really quickly. How about the videos? Are they available yet?
Yes, they are up and available. So if anyone missed out on any sessions at the Almond Conference, or if you weren't able to attend, because we don't do any remote tapping in during conference, it is all in person. You can view the recordings. They are currently on our website. If you go to almonds.com/conference, there will be a past presentations tile, and you just click on that and you can view and watch any session from the Almond Conference.
That makes it just so accessible for anybody.
Yes, totally. We know that this content that we have at the conference is so important and so vital, and that there are a lot of growers and a lot of industry members who weren't able to be in person. So we want to make sure that content's able to live on and continue to serve industry members.
And then this year there was a little bit of a change to the schedule, right?
Yes, there was a bit of a change. We did not have a gala dinner this year. So that was a big change. And when we came back from COVID, we hadn't quite brought the gala back either. So that's something that we hadn't done before, but historically we've always had the gala. And a lot of industry members have their own functions. We've been seeing attendance of the gala kind of decline over the years. So we decided to make a change and we removed the gala dinner, and I think it was a really good move on behalf of the Almond Conference and the future of the Almond Conference.
Yeah, that's the thing about these conferences. They're so rewarding and there's so much to do, but sometimes there's almost too much to do. And you can't be everywhere you want to be.
Definitely, especially 3 days, or technically 2.5 days. We really jam pack a lot into those days. And then on top of that, we know that so many industry members and exhibitors have their own functions that they're having or their own meetings at hotels or restaurants and whatnot. So yeah, just wanted to give a little more breathing room for that as well.
So what about the Wednesday, Thursday, Friday format? Is that something that we can expect for the coming years?
Yes, for sure for this year, for 2025. Historically, the Almond Conference has held the Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday pattern. This year, in December, the dates will be December 10th through 12th, and we are shifting to a Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So that will be something very different for this year. We're really trying to communicate that very clearly and consistently. We had a lot of communications on site this past December about those dates as well, because that will be something pretty different for this year compared to what our industry members are used to. So we're looking forward to seeing how that pattern kind of changes and how that will affect the Almond Conference.
So to get information about the Almond Conference, either those videos that we were talking about or the PDFs or information about the coming Almond Conference for 2025, can growers still go to almonds.com/conference?
Yes, almonds.com/conference is the place to go. We will continue to add updates to that site, especially this spring when we open exhibit sales and sponsorship opportunities. But that is the hub for all things Almond Conference and to stay connected and updated on what to expect for 2025.
All right, Rebecca, is there anything else that you want our listeners to know about the Almond Conference, this year's, last year's?
Yeah, I guess just to recap and add on to this past year's conference, just want to say a huge thank you to all of our exhibitors and sponsors who participated. We would not be able to have the Almond Conference without their support, and we are just super grateful for their partnership and their service on behalf of the industry. And we look forward to another fantastic show in 2025.
And again, if you want more information, you can go to almonds.com/conference. Thanks, Rebecca, for the time today. We appreciate it. This is the AgNet News Hour. I'm Sabrina Halvorson, and we'll be back in just a moment.
Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. Here's Sabrina Halvorson.
Now that 2024 is over, what were some of the economic trends for the farm sector from the past year? And how might those trends reflect projections for the 2025 farm economy? Rod Bain visits with the Agriculture Department's chief economist on some of the notable ag economic news from 2024 and how that might carry over to this year in this edition of Agriculture USA.
2024, for the most part, is in the books from a farm economic perspective. And some of the notable trends of the past year.
I think what we're doing is looking for a little bit of direction going forward from this standpoint. Producers' margins have narrowed significantly from a couple years of really good high farm income to more normal or farm income coming under some pressure. That's all happened over the last year.
Could impact what the ag sector faces economically in 2025. I'm Rod Bain. Agriculture Department Chief Economist Seth Meyer joins us as we review the 2024 ag economic year and how that may shape farm economic factors this year in this edition of Agriculture USA.
What was the big earth-shaking black swan surprise in 24?
From an agricultural economic perspective, That question, asked by USDA Chief Economist Seth Meyer, is based on trends of the past few years.
If we look over the last 4 years, you got trade friction with China, then you have pandemic issues, then you got a price run up from the war in Ukraine, and then you've got perhaps some production shocks around the world. You have some countries like India putting export controls on rice.
Yet in Meyer's opinion, for 2024,
after 4 years where there were lots of black swan, there really wasn't one this year.
That's not to say there were not notable events impacting the U.S. ag economy. However, with no one single geopolitical or pandemic global event causing a shock in farm prices,
we haven't seen a shock which would leave prices higher, so we've continued to grind lower most of the year. And so we're kind of looking for a bottom and looking to where we go from here.
An example of declining commodity prices can be found with cotton.
We started the year with a cotton price more like 80 cents a pound, and now we're down into the mid-60s in our forecast for the current year's crop prices. So we've seen commodity prices year over year declining pretty much across the board.
And while farm prices for livestock producers were mixed in 2024, that trend could impact 2025 plans in that,
while profitability has been better than on the crop side, I think there remain challenges for expansion in several of the livestock sectors.
Projected continued decline in most commodity prices are expected in 2025, as is also continued tightening margins for producers.
We definitely have to break things out into differences between crops and livestock, and I think overall crops have fared worse and livestock fared better from an income standpoint, but not without some other issues.
The chief economist says tighter margins were due in part to input cost.
We're seeing commodity prices which have fallen pretty fast, pretty far, pretty quickly, but not all the input prices have done the same, and that's kind of where we end up with these tighter margins.
Some input costs have come down over the past year.
Fertilizer prices have come down. Are they all pre-pandemic levels or this last pre-spike levels? No, they haven't.
However, one input expected to remain high cost-wise, especially in ag sectors such as specialty crops, is labor.
That's been one of the inputs which is not expected to moderate in price, and that input remains strong. So that means you're facing a lot of competition from overseas, that trend of horticultural product imports.
Now, what about the potential of a price shock in 2025? Meyer elaborates.
The big question is, if we're done with that moderation, where does the market sit in terms of its ability to respond to another shock? When you look around the world, I think that that's why we're taking such a close look on South American production, Russian wheat production, etc. The market seems to be satisfied with where supplies are at the moment. And usually you see a confluence of forces that put another shock into the market, at least on the supply side, to set off another price spike or a big geopolitical event. Geopolitical events can work on both sides of that market, either positive or negative.
Turning to trade, regarding the U.S. agricultural trade balance in 2024,
our expectation is for a record trade deficit
due to several factors, such as a strong U.S. dollar overseas, increased global competition for primary U.S. farm commodities such as corn and soybeans, and
with that strong dollar, U.S. consumers continue to import products to diversify their diets as well, too.
The chief economist also notes some of the global market challenges for our nation's food and farm exports going into 2025.
Policy being one of them, things that we always talk about, size of the South American crop, but other things as well. We've still got an active conflict in the Black Sea, other geopolitical tensions, all of which could affect the market in the coming year.
This has been Agriculture USA. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
That's our show for today. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. On behalf of Lorrie Boyer and myself, thank you for sharing your morning with us.
To get more information on the topics you heard today, visit AgNet West at agnetwest.com. You can also stay connected by following us on our social media at AgNet West on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Also look for Sabrina Halvorson on Facebook, and be sure to subscribe to our podcast by searching for AgNet West on your podcast app. Thank you for listening to the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. AgNet West Radio Network, your primary choice for agriculture news.